Radio Free South Africa. This is your host, Karen Smith. Tonight we are going to give you episode 2 of the historical figures of South Africa. We are going to concentrate tonight on Cecil John Rhodes. And here with me to talk about it is Cuan Elgin, a fabulous historian and the author, as I have told you before, of that must-read South African book, Bulala, A True Story of South Africa. Welcome, Cuan.
Hello, Karen. Nice to speak to you again.
It's great to have you on again. Cuan, you sent me off on this odyssey of looking into Cecil John Rhodes. And boy, what a man he was. Love him or hate him, he was an incredible man.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. He's liked and disliked in equal proportions, I think. And whether we like him or not, I think we cannot deny his massive contribution to South Africa and to other countries as well, of course. But he was quite a guy, as you rightly say, and his legacy is with us today in so many areas. And I think he can claim to have contributed more to the building of South Africa into a modern nation than any other single figure.
Absolutely. And the reason we decided to bring him up now is because together with Jan van Riebeeck, Rhodes has suddenly become a focal point for hatred in South Africa.
He has indeed. We have at the moment a very vociferous campaign at University of Cape Town. It started there. Rhodes Must Fall is the name of the campaign, hashtag and all. And they have actually removed his statue from the plinth in the centre of the university, despite the fact that the university itself is established on grounds that he donated. And not far from there is the world-famous Kirstenbosch Gardens, which he also donated to the people of South Africa. And everywhere you turn in South Africa are massive, beautiful public buildings, which he had commissioned at his own expense, mainly by Herbert Baker, Sir Herbert Baker, the famous architect. Rhodes donated virtually his entire real estate to the people of South Africa, and as I think most people know, the Rhodes scholarships every year are given out, a very substantial bursary to study at Oxford. I think it's Oriel particularly, and his legacy is one of constructive donation. In other words, he has left us with things that we can use. His buildings, his estates, his money. I don't think there's too many politicians, because he was at the end of the day a politician and a businessman. Not too many have left such a wonderful legacy anywhere in the world. And for that reason alone, whether we liked him or not as a man, and he's not around to defend himself, whether we like him or not as a historical figure, we cannot deny the contribution he's made. And in his day, he was a highly respected man. He was a ruthless businessman. I think we will concede to that. He was an imperialist, a British imperialist to the core, but in those days that was considered a good thing. And he was a man of vision. He had a huge, broad vision of a Cape to Cairo railroad, painting the map red, as he said, which meant British red, basically from Cape to Cairo as wherever he could. And he was a man of huge vision and great energy. And the astounding thing is he died very young. He died just before he turned 50. So he achieved an incredible amount in his short life, and he suffered from ill health right from the beginning. So he somehow still found the energy and the drive and the determination and the wherewithal to become a great man. And great has many connotations, but certainly in the South African historical context, he towers above most others. And he was even referred to as the Colossus of Rhodes in his day. He had such an impact on history at the time worldwide, and we can go into that because he actually set up a society. Many people would refer to it as an Illuminati type society in his time, which many people aren't aware of, but we can expound on that as we go.
Yes, and so before we go into where he was born and what he's achieved, the whole Rhodes Must Fall thing has then spread to England via South African people, creating an uproar about Rhodes Must Fall at the university there, and now there's a new controversy started by that same scholar on a Rhodes Scholarship in the UK, who is benefiting hugely from this man's largesse and yet demanding that every trace of him must be removed.
It's actually quite laughable. The Rhodes scholar is a young black chap from South Africa who is on a very substantial bursary at Oxford University, which was Rhodes's alma mater, and as we know, alma mater means great mother. So this young fellow is now insulting his great mother. He is there to study, he's there to learn, and he, ironically, has been the one who's been most vociferous about having Rhodes's statue removed from Oxford University on the basis that Rhodes was an imperialist and a racist and various other things, which he obviously hasn't studied history very well, because Rhodes was far from a racist. In fact, he stated in writing, Rhodes, that all men, black and white, were worthy of the vote. This is going back 100 years or more. So long, he said, as they had some education, owned property, or had a job, i.e., were not loafers. So he was quite a visionary for his day, because in the attitudes in those days towards anybody who wasn't English, let alone anyone who wasn't white, was very different to, let's say, the more enlightened attitudes of today. So for this young chap to demand that his benefactor, essentially, his statue should be pulled down, I think the rector, was it the rector of Rhodes or somebody there, a spokesman of sorts, came out with quite a good statement. And he noted that, well, first of all, I think he suggested that the young chap should consider studying elsewhere if he didn't like the idea of studying in the shadow of Rhodes' statue, who in fact provided his scholarship. But he mentioned that down the road, as they say, Cambridge University was largely established by King Henry VIII, who beheaded a couple of his wives. So what should they do? Burn down Cambridge? We can't change history. And all men have feet of clay, great men included, perhaps more so very often. And Rhodes, one could argue he did a lot more good than he did bad. And certainly, I think if this young man follows his conscience, he should return the bursary and say he will not use this imperialist money to further his own education. He'd rather do it himself. Incidentally, Rhodes did it himself by earning money on the streets of Kimberley, which we'll go into in some detail, I'm sure. He educated himself. He paid for his own studies at Oxford and made the expensive and long sea voyage more than a few times to actually complete his studies. He saw himself through a degree at Oxford on his own steam. And this young man has had his way paid for him, and yet he finds cause to criticize his benefactor. Very strange.
It is, to me, it's just unfathomable that you can benefit from the thing, but his reasoning for that appears to be that, well, the diamonds that Rhodes made his money off anyway belong to Africans. So, it's merely getting back what belonged to them in the first place. And all the labor was on the sweat of the backs of the blacks. So Rhodes didn't own the money, the blacks do. So it's kind of a redistribution of wealth, seems to be his reasoning behind that. Anyway, it's just very interesting how the Boers, who have more reason to dislike Rhodes than anybody else, never, ever thought of putting down his statues or destroying a university or any of those things. And yet the black people who are benefiting from it just want to destroy it. So that was just a piece of interest, I think, that might interest the world, because most people don't know what is happening in South Africa. So I think it's a good place to start. Cuan, tell us now about Rhodes, who he was, how he came to Africa, and what he did, because what a man.
Indeed, what a man. He was born to a vicar in England in 1853 in a little town. He was born into, you could say, almost a lower middle-class family. They were not wealthy at all. And his brother, who was somewhat older than him, Frank Rhodes, had set out for South Africa to establish a cotton farming enterprise in Natal, which is alongside Zululand. and it was considered the most suitable place in South Africa to try and grow cotton. As it turned out, it was a failure. But in the interim, the diamonds had been discovered in Kimberley, and of an enormous wealth of diamonds had been discovered in the what is a volcanic pipe, essentially. And Frank Rhodes, by then realizing his cotton farming enterprise was a disaster, headed for these diamond fields to try and make his fortune. Cecil had, in the interim, been sent out, the younger brother, because of his poor health. He suffered, it seems like almost a form of tuberculosis. Certainly his lungs and heart had been affected. And at school, he was not much of an athlete except at cricket. He did reasonably well at cricket. He headed out thinking that the climate would be healthier for him at the age of 17. So a young boy and brave enough to go out to Africa. By the time he arrived at his brother's cotton farm, the brother had essentially decided to pack it in and head for the Diamond Fields Road, stayed on the farm for a while, and then eventually followed in his brother's footsteps and ended up in Kimberley, which was then very much a frontier town in the northern, well, it was for a while in the Orange Free State, or geographically it should be, but it was annexed very cleverly by the British to the Cape, so which was a colony of Britain. So they basically stole the diamond fields from the Boer Republic of the Free State, but that's another subject. But he ended up there, and he, contrary to what this young scholar claims, that the sweat of the brow of the black folks dug the diamonds, there were as many white folk digging physically in the pits on these little claims in Kimberley. And Rhodes himself, he was described more than once as being covered in dust, sweating, scruffy, physically working in these diamond fields. And he, at one stage, was reduced to selling ice creams on the streets of Kimberley. So he really started off way down the social rung with no money to speak of. And then he teamed up with a few other fellas, and they got the idea of hiring pumping equipment from the Cape, having it brought up, because as the pit got deeper, and it ended up the deepest and largest hand-dug, man-made pit in the world. It's absolutely massive. Anyone who's visited it is completely overawed. And an aerial photograph can do some justice, and you realize that this hole was dug by hand, pick and shovel. But it started to fill up with water, many of the claims, because they'd got so low, they'd actually got below the water table. And Rhodes and his companions decided to bring up some pumping equipment from Cape Town and hire it out. So they actually started making some real money. And just with that seed money, Rhodes headed off to Oxford, paid for his own studies, unlike this young chap who's now on a Rhodes Scholarship, yet doesn't appreciate it. And on his own volition, on his own steam, with his own money, he went and he eventually got himself a degree. He had to go backwards and forwards a couple of times. But in the interim, the diamond fields had become quite dangerous in the sense that these little claims, and I've actually got the stats here, they were measured in feet rather than in meters. In fact, they were each approximately 4.5 meters wide. It's about 15 feet wide. So here nominally a claim was 31 feet by 31 feet. That's about as big as they got.
Wow.
And they left open a strip in between them. So eventually these little strips started to collapse into the diggings, and it became extremely dangerous. So a chap called Barney Bonato, whose actual name was Barnett Isaacs, he was a Cockney prize fighter, vaudeville artist, showman, but obviously quite a switched-on guy, to use modern parlance. He started buying up these little claims that couldn't be worked anymore because of the danger, and consolidating them into a bigger claim that could be more successfully worked. And I'm shortening the entire story because the Kimberley story in itself has been the subject of many, many books and wonderful stories. But this is the basis of it. And Rhodes, by the time he had made a bit of money, wasn't yet in a position to actually buy up any great claims. So it might surprise a lot of people. And I have in front of me some research done by a chap called Robin Brown, who spent 15 years researching Rhodes himself and published his book quite recently. So it's one of the most up-to-date or topical books on Rhodes. And he's of the opinion, and there's some evidence to support it in my own book, when you mentioned Bulala, that Rhodes was to some extent not working for Rothschild Bank, but he was sponsored by them.
Yes.
And he managed to raise £1 million loan to continue his entrepreneurship on the digs.
Cuan.
And in those days, £1 million
Yeah.
was a huge amount of money. So that was in modern day maybe, what would it be, 20 times, maybe £20 million in today's money, which is, I think, in the region of $35 million, somewhere around there. So a lot of money. Rothschild. But Rothschild apparently saw him as a very good prospect and basically used him to get a foot in the door there. He later, Rhodes, wrote out the biggest personal check ever written out in the British Empire up to that date for £5 million, which, again, in modern parlance, probably £100 million today.
Wow.
What is that? Close on $150 million personal check to buy out Barney Bonato's shares. Barney by then had managed to consolidate many of the claims, and it was backed again by Rothschild's bank. So there is some speculation that Rothschild was in right from the beginning via Cecil Rhodes, and a little bit later, if I can, I'll quote from this work by this gentleman, Robin Brown, who goes into the background here. But at a later stage in Rhodes's life, a lady appeared on the scene, not just any lady. And Rhodes was known not to have time, really, for the fairest sex. He was extremely dedicated to his work. He had some close friends, but he had little time for socializing as such. He saw every minute of his life as vital, and he had to achieve something in the time that he was given. And he seemed to realize from the start that because of his ill health, that he might not live long. He wrote out his first will when he was 19. I think he was 19 years old. He wrote out his first will, and he kept updating it throughout his life. So he had this almost a premonition, one could say, that he may not live for that long. So he had this drive to achieve as much as he possibly could. And this lady appeared on the ship on one of his journeys back from England. She was, as I say, not just any lady. This was a Polish princess by the name of Katarina Radziwiłł, of the noble Polish family Radziwiłł, who were very much supporters of the Protestant cause in centuries gone by. And she was a woman, I think she was divorced at that stage. I can quote from my book on her. I have written something about her. But basically, she just appeared in his life and kind of muscled in. And at one stage, she was telling people in Cape Town, where they ended up, that she and Rhodes were engaged to be married, etc. But she was, it seemed, a little bit of a gold digger, and she spent his money like water. He was actually advised, apparently, at one stage to get an attractive woman as a hostess to officiate at his functions, etc., because people were starting to murmur about him not being married and never being seen with women, etc. And in those days, of course, very conservative. If there was any suggestion that he might be batting for the other side, shall we say, that it wouldn't have gone down well. And he was a politician at a later stage, so he needed to keep a good public image. So perhaps he thought that she might be ideal. But as I say, she was intellectually challenging for him. She was a very bright woman. I think he enjoyed her company. But she spent his money like water, and in the first year or so spent millions of his money on lavish functions and balls and receptions and so on, which is exactly what he was advised to have a woman for, is to officiate at these functions. But she really went overboard, and he eventually had to cut off her allowances. Wealthy as he was at that stage, he actually started to feel the pinch, and he cut off her allowances, and she repeatedly forged his signature on a check to pay off some of her bills. And he got so angry about this, he actually laid charges against her, and she was arrested and had to appear in court. And she countercharged him with what she called loan fraud. Now, no one's quite been able to figure out exactly what sort of legal term that is, but I would imagine she was saying that he gave her the money or allowed her to spend the money, and only when he changed his mind, he then said it was a loan. So she had to pay it back somehow, and she had no means of doing so, so she called it loan fraud. So he had to appear in court as well. Yes. And it upset him greatly, and it did no good to his health. And shortly after, he in fact died. So we've jumped well ahead, but we will fill in the details in between. But he didn't seem to have much time for women, and yet he had many admirers, women admirers. Olive Schreiner was one of them. She's a famous South African author. She wrote Life on an African Farm, and she was highly regarded in her day as an intellectual and as an author and as a political commentator, social activist, etc. And she quite fancied Rhodes, to put it that way. But she fell out with him eventually because she believed that he was behind what was called the Jameson Raid, which we can get into in some detail. It changed the course of history in South Africa, this so-called Jameson Raid. And he was, in fact, behind it. So she had every right to be upset with him because she saw it drove a wedge between the Afrikaner, or the Cape Afrikaner, as they were called, and the upcountry Afrikaners had started to be called Boers by then because they had established the Boer republics. They were track Boers, wandering farmers who eventually established two Boer republics. She was quite right, and he was, in fact, behind it, not just him, though. And it was an attempt to overthrow Paul Kruger, President Kruger's Transvaal Republic, because by then all the wealthy entrepreneurs had made their fortunes on the diamond fields of Kimberley, and they had covetous eyes cast towards the Transvaal, where gold had been discovered. So once again, all the focus shifted again, and there was this attempt to overthrow the Transvaal government, supposedly in support of what they called the Uitlanders, the Outlanders, those who had no votes, but they weren't interested in the votes, as I can quote from my book, which I can do a little bit later. But that's just a broad canvas. Rhodes had an imperial vision. He was very much an imperialist. He saw that the British Empire would be the great power, which it was then, the greatest empire the world has ever seen. In fact, greater even than the Roman Empire in its spread, but not quite in its duration. But he saw this as a great force for peace, Pax Britannica, as we had Pax Romana. Britain could hold the world together under basically gunboat diplomacy, which they were famous for, but in a way, in a sense that like America does today. Just the mere thought of America getting angry with your country because of what you're up to and the incredible military might, Britain was in the same position in those days, where they just the mere thought that Britain didn't like what you were doing kind of got you back in line. They were incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy. They had colonies all over the world. It was called the empire on which the sun never sets, because literally the sun shone on some part of the world that was part of the British Empire at all times. That's how widespread it was. And the Queen Victoria, of course, was the long-serving monarch, and she and Rhodes died almost at about the same time, early 1900s. But Rhodes had this great vision, and he fought a society, which we can go into some detail on, which brought together all the great minds and great money powers, which would be these days called the bankers, into a kind of a secret society. And they were almost a shadow cabinet in Britain, according to Robert Brown, who didn't manipulate the British cabinet, but certainly influenced it very powerfully, and influenced the direction of British foreign policy. But in many ways, it wasn't necessarily a malicious or mendacious kind of an organization as we would think today. The conspiracy theorists will tell you the Illuminati is all bad. Those words, Illuminati, or that word Illuminati, that label was first apparently used by Lord Alfred Milner more than 100 years ago, the British governor of the Cape eventually, and Rhodes being before him as a governor in the Cape. But those words, or that name was used then, the Illuminati, and they considered themselves, the illuminated, aware ones who, through their influence and their power, they said, would be able to prevent wars. So there was a good side to this thing, not just making money. Rhodes had said at one stage that the first prize for any man in the world was to be born English. So he was very much an Englishman and very much an imperialist. And his greatest wish was the reunification of the United States and Britain, the mother country. And in a way, he got it right to a great extent. When America and Britain fought a very fierce war of independence, of course, early 1800s, late 17s, early 18s, and so there was a lot of animosity. But that's largely history now, and the United States and America and the United Kingdom will very often vote together on very important issues most of the time, and agree on most things. They are allies, very strong allies. And of course, the United States supported Great Britain in the First World War, Second World War, and it was the might of the industrial complex of the United States, which certainly in the Second World War swung the balance of power in favor of the Allies. So they kind of achieved it in a way, although some will argue that Britain was an aggressor in the Second World War, Churchill, etc. That's a different subject. But in many ways, he achieved it. We have Anglo-American, the famous, powerful corporation. What does that say? Anglo-American. And the foundation of that was way back to Rhodes's day, and then on to the Oppenheimers, etc. Rothschild always involved. So Rhodes was very much a key figure and a pivot at that time in this whole New World Order. And as I say, a conspiracy theorist's ears will immediately prick up and say, aha, New World Order. All bad. But if one digs a little deeper, the initial motivation, shall we say, wasn't necessarily only for control. It was also for influence and a way of preventing wars. That certainly was one of the motivations. And of course, if you control public opinion, you can control a lot more than just public opinion. You control the way things go, and you can steer them in the directions that you want to. So to do that, you have to control the media. So the newspaper owners were pulled in, some of the very powerful ones and the bigger newspapers in the UK, into this so-called secret society to influence public opinion, and which they did very successfully from their point of view. So Rhodes was instrumental in all of this, and his greatness, if we can call it that, can be argued in many different ways as being a greatness based on wealth. Well, yes, indeed. Although there's much evidence to show that the initial spadework, literally, was put in by Rhodes. He didn't get born with a golden or silver spoon, certainly, and he was an astute man. He was a very influential man, a very persuasive man, and a very brave man, despite all indications otherwise that he was not physically all that robust, although he was a fairly big chap. He, at one stage, approached the Matabele king in what became Rhodesia, one of the few men in history who've had a country named after him. Unfortunately now no longer. It's Zimbabwe, a bit of a basket case, but it was Rhodesia for 80-odd years. And he approached Lobengula, who was pretty much the savage king of the Matabele, which is an offshoot of the Zulu, unarmed with a very small escort to negotiate terms and settlements, etc., because they'd managed to get a concession to respect in Lobengula's lands. He controlled what became Rhodesia, what became Zimbabwe, after the Matabele had subjugated the resident Shona, the other tribe, which in fact Robert Mugabe comes from, the Shona. They were always the majority tribe, but they were the subject tribe under the Matabele. And the Matabele were a warrior tribe, and they very much admired his bravery, approaching them essentially unarmed, unprotected. They considered that very brave, and I think that is why, to this very day, his remains, Cecil Rhodes's remains, are on the Matopos Hills in a crypt there, and undisturbed, because they considered him a very great man. And the legend has it that they gave a royal salute to him at his funeral. Some will say, oh, that was orchestrated or choreographed, but all the same, they did appear there in their numbers, the Matabele warriors, and give him a send-off, royal salute. So they certainly respected him as a man. And I think this has been forgotten now. He's not around to defend himself, obviously, But it's very easy to criticize a man who died 100 odd years ago and point out all the bad things. But he achieved an incredible amount in his short life, and in his day he was considered a great man. And it's a shame that his legend, the good part of it anyway, has been forgotten, and only the bad stuff, the imperialism, the ruthless businessman, etc. That seems to be remembered, and that people have actually got the gall these days, even though they are on Rhodes scholarships, to actually call for the pulling down of his statues. And statues aren't necessarily always put up in admiration of the person, but in commemoration of the person. I mean, there's statues of Genghis Khan. There's statues in the local context of Shaka Zulu. Shaka Zulu was, in some historians' minds, a genocidal maniac. He killed hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of his own people, or of other tribes that he subjugated. Absolutely ruthless man, but a wonderful military strategist, a great general, etc. So that was the good side of him. He was a unique man in the Black African context. Certainly, Shaka. His statues still stand. Nobody's talking about pulling them down. As South Africans, we accept that he's part of our history. Yet, one could expand at great length on all the bad things he did. But he was a great man in his context, and a great general, a military man, and he formed the Zulu nation, which incidentally, up until the early 1820s, was a minor clan. No one had heard of them. He forged them into a nation. So the Zulus, surprised a lot of people, are actually much younger as a nation than the Afrikaner. So anyone who says that the black tribes own the land and the whites stole it from them doesn't know their history. And certainly this young man who's at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship doesn't know his, because Kimberley was a magnet for prospectors from all over the world, pick and shovel men, and the vast majority of them did their own physical labor. And it was the black folk who came by choice to those mines to work and earn some money and to buy the luxuries of civilized life. They came from wilderness areas to another wilderness area. There was nothing there, absolutely nothing there. It was a desolate area. It was, in fact, what we call a kopje, which is a small hill, ended up a massive hole. It was dug by sweat and blood. And the vast majority of the prospectors were in fact white. And if a black chap went there and looking for work, well, that was by choice, so that he could buy things. So for this young chap to distort history in the way that he has is disingenuous, and he really, I believe, should be castigated for this. And he's creating a furore about nothing. And if his conscience serves him properly, he should, in fact, return the bursary with interest to the university for it to be used by somebody else who would appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. We in general don't have reason to love Rhodes, but at the same time, what he bequeathed and the things that he did, he was responsible for much of the infrastructure in Rhodesia and South Africa. He did an incredible thing. And I admire the Afrikaner for not trying to write him out of history, because he is one of the great figures of Southern African history.
Absolutely. I think we've got to give it to the Afrikaner, or the Boer, as the Northern Afrikaners call themselves, that they haven't joined this campaign to say Rhodes must fall. He was no friend of theirs, really. Initially, he tried did, to his credit, try and unite the what they would have called Dutch in those days, or the Cape Afrikaners, and the English-speaking folks who mainly arrived from about 1820 onwards, 150 years after the first Dutch settlers. He initially tried to unite them, but with his vision, it was to unite the whole of South Africa, and ultimately the whole of Southern Africa, and ultimately as much of Africa as they could get hold of to build their railway through to Cairo. So he wanted to unite the country, and he saw that the division, which was mainly a language division at that stage between the Afrikaner, who spoke a form of Dutch, and the English speakers, was an impediment. And he was very good friends with some very illustrious Afrikaners in his day, newspaper owners, etc. And he was a statesman in many ways. So I think the Afrikaner recognizes that. Yet he did, as I say, change the course of our history by funding, it seems, and certainly backing the infamous Jameson raid, which was a futile attempt to try and overthrow a very popular president, Paul Kruger, in the Transvaal, and it failed miserably. And it was called Jameson raid because his friend Dr. Jameson, Leander Starr Jameson, led the raid. And Jameson was a very what would be the word, impulsive type of person. He was a very bright chap, a medical doctor, and they were close friends. And in fact, Jameson ended up, after Rhodes had to resign in embarrassment when it was exposed that he was largely responsible for this abortive raid into the Transvaal from what was then Rhodesia. Later on, Jameson ended up as governor of the Cape after Rhodes had to resign. So they were very, very much working closely together. Just a little aside, when Rhodes was born in 1853 and arrived in South Africa in 1871 as a teenager, but incidentally, just for your American listeners, in that same year, another young man, Alfred Aloysius Smith, would arrive in South Africa from Glasgow and work as a prospector and trader, later become famous as the adventurous hero known as Trader Horn. I think the Americans know the book Trader Horn, but like Rhodes, he had to start at the bottom, and before becoming famous, he was reduced to selling mouse traps from door to door.
Wow.
So a lot of the chaps who came out to South Africa in those days found the going tough. But eventually, if they had the energy and the determination, they could make something of themselves.
Well, the gold rushes all over the world. There was the famous California gold rush, etc., etc.
Yes.
People from all over the world took their last remaining pennies to get there and bought themselves a pick and shovel and a donkey, and off they went to make their fortune. Now, my great-grandfather was one of those. He left Scotland and he came to the United States with his pick and shovel, and he was a rich man. He worked he was an area manager of a big insurance company in Scotland, and so he was a well-to-do Scottish gentleman, and he just down tools everything. He just walked away from his family, from his job. He didn't tell anyone he was going. He just went off to make his fortune, and he was going to surprise them all within weeks with all this gold he was going to send home. Well, he, like many, many others, came home broke. He was lucky he even got back home, because a lot of them died, and a lot of them just didn't have the money to go back home. So he was fortunate that he made enough money to come back home, but he certainly didn't come home with the riches. So these people from all over the world would rush out to these gold and diamond finds, and they were going to get rich. And it took incredible hard work and fortitude to make any money out of it.
Indeed. South Africa was and is a tough country, harsh conditions. There are very mild areas, mild climate and good fertile soil in many areas in the country, but largely it's a semi-arid country with an extreme climate, and it's tough going. I think the sort of badlands of the United States would be a fair comparison of what Kimberley looked like before they started mining there and built essentially a shanty town at first, which has now grown into quite a substantial town. But this was shortly after the United States Civil War between North and South ended in 1865. Shortly after that, only 2 years later, so many things happening in the States and happening here at the same time, other side of the world. But history is almost parallel in many ways. As you mentioned, the Klondike Gold Rush. Before gold was discovered in any quantity in South Africa, as you mentioned, diamonds were discovered on the banks of the Orange River, which is our largest river, certainly our longest river, in 1867 at a place called Klipdrift, which means rocky drift or rocky ford. And it was a child picked up a shiny stone, handed it to an adult who thought, well, this looks interesting. And they took it to someone who perhaps would know more about this, and so it went on until it was realized this was in fact a large alluvial diamond, so alongside the river. And strangely enough, 6 years before, the area had been sold to a coloured, they called them coloured, it was a mixed race tribe, the leader being a chap called Adam Cock, had been given to them or sold virtually for nothing by the local authorities. And then once the discovery of the diamonds were made, there was a flood of claims of ownership by various individuals, tribes, and even the government of both Boer republics, the north being the Transvaal and the southern one being the Orange Free State. And the matter became a bit of a powder keg, so it was sent to the governor of Natal for his arbitration, thinking he'd be neutral. Of course, he wasn't. He decided in favor of a paramount chief of the Griqua, this colored mixed-race tribe. He decided in favor of them. But this chap seemed strangely unconcerned about all the wealth lying around and promptly handed the area over to the British Crown. So I think there was a bit of dealing in the background there where they probably had a deal with him. It's, of course, not documented, this chief, that they would decide in favor of him owning this land so long as he handed it over to the Crown. And I think some money did change hands. That is recorded as compensation for handing over the ground. But, of course, the incredible wealth that was lying around soon outshone anything that they would have paid for it. And no sooner had this been done than the Cape Colony, British-controlled, quickly annexed this diamond area to the Cape Colony, thereby depriving the little Boer Republic of the Orange Free State of a major source of future income. But geographically, the main diamond area was clearly part of the Orange Free State, in that it lay east of both the Vaal and the Orange Rivers. And this was disputed because of that. And a later land court declared that the original claim by this Griqua tribe, this coloured tribe, had been invalid. So the Crown, now having annexed it, paid the then huge sum of £90,000 to the Orange Free State Boer Republic for compensation. But it turned out to be a pittance compared to the actual value of the diamonds discovered in the area. And the diggers flooded into the area from the far corners of the earth by whatever transport was available, and soon turned their attentions to a newly discovered, incredibly rich volcanic pipe, which was called kimberlite after the British Lord Kimberley, and it became the town of Kimberley. It was originally a hill, as mentioned, but once excavated, became the largest, deepest man-made hand-dug hole in the world. And that's where Rhodes arrived in search of his brother. After the cotton enterprise had failed, he was a very young man, I say he was still in his late teens. And he slowly but surely, as he made a little bit of money out of selling ice creams, would you believe? Good place to sell them. A hot and dusty town like Kimberley. And he eventually managed to consolidate many of the unstable small claims there by buying out Barney Bonata, as mentioned, for the then biggest private check ever written out in the British Empire.
Wow.
Backed by Rothschild's bank.
Well, it's just amazing how this man, who had very poor health, yet he did absolute physical labor, and even reduced to selling ice creams. I mean, when you think about Rhodes today, you could never imagine that this man was your ice cream man ringing his bell on the side of the road. It's just so funny.
Incredible. It is incredible. He was an imperialist to the core, as we mentioned, and he would make waves in South African history, which would reverberate well into the second half of the next century. But there was somebody standing in his way, and that was a big Boer, Afrikaner Boer, a very religious, staunchly religious man and an ex-lion hunter by the name of Paul Kruger, who would stand in Rhodes's way at every turn. And of course, Kruger eventually became, after a couple of terms, as vice president of the Transvaal Republic, which was then called the ZAR, the Zuid-Afrikaanse South African Republic. He became the third president of the Republic, and it was a post he held for four terms. And Rhodes and him eventually did clash, of course, when it was realized that Rhodes was behind this Jameson raid, this attempt to overthrow Kruger, based on a raison de guerre, an excuse for aggression, saying that the Uitlanders, the diggers, the outlanders who'd come in were denied the vote, etc. But it really was just a ploy. it was the gold they wanted. And in fact, Kruger himself, who was quite a wily old man, he was no fool. He said, "It is not the vote that the British wants; it's my country," and he was absolutely right. And of course, it wasn't many years after the failed attempt to overthrow his regime that the Anglo-Boer War, the Second Anglo-Boer War, broke out, 1899 to 1902, a devastating war, which completely changed the whole face of South Africa. And Rhodes used his steadily increasing wealth and prestige to implement his grand vision to the British government, or convince them of his grand vision. And as I mentioned, his imperialistic aim was to paint the map red, British red, from Cape to Cairo. And the British at that stage still thought they'd have no trouble overthrowing a nation which they still considered to be a backward rabble of rustic farmers, as they saw them, the Boers. But as it turned out, it was a fiercely fought war, and for the first 6 months to a year, the British Army took a pounding from these so-called rural farmers, who formed their very effective commandos, fast-moving, hard-hitting, and with modern German rifles. They gave the British a really tough time, and to this day, they're revered as fighters. The word commando comes from them. It was initially a voluntary rural system of protection, where if there was trouble, they would just call up all the local farmers. He had to arrive with his own rifle, his own horse, his own blanket, a few days' food, and they'd form these commandos, and they would go and do what they had to do. And in fact, they gave the British Army such a bloody nose, so to speak, that the British Special Forces in the First World War and right up to the Second World War, who wanted to start calling themselves commandos, these small, highly mobile units, were not allowed to call themselves commandos because of the bad memories from the Anglo-Boer War, the pounding they took from these Boer commandos. And eventually, I think they prevailed and they were allowed to call themselves commandos. But it was only in the Second World War that the British, these little strike forces, became called commandos. Before that, they weren't allowed to call themselves commandos because of the bad memories. But Rhodes, having made a vast personal fortune on the diamond fields of Kimberley, soon became a major player on the gold fields of the Transvaal. And in 1895, these new consolidated gold fields had a virtual monopoly on exploiting the deep and difficult to extract veins of gold. The days of the lone, happy-go-lucky prospector with a donkey and a pick and shovel were basically over by then. And Rhodes had befriended many wealthy landlords, including Alfred Beit, Sir Lionel Phillips, etc., added greatly to his financial muscle, and occasionally Rhodes would refer patronizingly to his Jews as he called them, and asserted that wherever they went, prosperity would soon follow, or perhaps it was the other way around. And as I mentioned, he had bought out in Kimberley a chap who was known as Barney Bonato, but was in fact Barney Isaacs, for £5 million. And they say what swung the deal for Barney to sell out to Rhodes was a promise of membership of the prestige Kimberley Club, which until that stage didn't admit Jews. So it was kind of a prestige thing to join, and it's rumored that Rhodes promised him membership, and that kind of swung the deal. And there was another man by the name of Sir Abraham, or Abe Bailey, a Jew of Irish descent, who made a fortune in the first gold rush, which was Eastern Transvaal, Barberton. And these guys between them they were known as the Randlords, or the Gold Bugs. And I think it was a bit of a play on Goldberg, but Gold Bugs. And they had enough money to really influence political events. And they had the backing of many of the big bankers overseas. They had the backing of, as I mentioned earlier, these influential newspapers. And the end result, and I'm just going to, if I can, I'm just going to call up here on my laptop here a quote or two, if I might, from Robin Brown's book, which is called Cecil Rhodes and His Secret Society for a New World Order, which will go into some depth here, but I'll just quote very briefly from it. Just got to get to it there. There it is. It's by renowned author and documentary producer Robin Brown, and he provides not just a wealth of grist for the conspiracy theorist Mills, but it's a scholarly tome on the intricacies of the state of the British Empire from the time of the discovery of diamonds and gold in South Africa, in the latter half of the 1800s up to the decade after the Second World War. As I say, published only last year, so it's very much up to date. And it goes into some depth into Rhodes's public and personal life, as well as we alluded to earlier, his long suspected sexual preferences. But, that's really got nothing to do with his greatness. But it's always been a subject of speculation. Was he in fact what they'd call gay today? You would think that he'd get brownie points for that these days, but he doesn't.
Apparently not.
Brown, yes. Brown collates the work of many other eminent historians and expounds much on newly discovered documentation dealing with the doings of this secret society. After Rhodes, this society was taken forward by Lord Alfred Milner, who was then governor of the Cape. And then, strangely, they say today the child of that society is the Round Table, the innocuous organisation, the Round Table, which advertises itself as a place to have fun and meet people and do charitable works, etc., rather like some other infinitely more secretive organisations claiming to do the same. However, during the period of roughly a century under study in this work, myriad big names crop up directly involved or supporting this secret society which Rhodes set up, or crossing swords with it. And it was essentially, it turns out, a virtually a shadow cabinet in Britain throughout that period. Its members invariably being super wealthy, extremely powerful, many of them British nobility. The New World Order, the common name that we hear often these days, was first used by Lord Alfred Milner, over a century ago. And in amongst this society were the usual suspects that this conspiracy theorist reckons have been pulling the strings worldwide. They're there all right, from the Rothschilds to the Rockefellers to George Bernard Shaw, General Gordon of Khartoum, Leander Starr Jameson, that was Rhodes's friend who launched the abortive raid into the Transvaal to try and overthrow Kruger's government. Milner, of course, Lord Alfred Milner. W.T. Stead, influential British newspaper editor. Joseph Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister. David Lloyd George, another one. Philip Kerr, Lady Nancy Astor. Lady Nancy Astor, of course, is famous or infamous for always rubbing up Winston Churchill the wrong way. And the story is told that she's the one that he lurched against in a lift. He was known to enjoy his whiskey, old Winston Churchill.
Yes.
And she said something like, "Sir, you are drunk." And he said, "Well, madam, you are ugly, but in the morning I'll be sober." And she'll still be ugly. And apparently she once in Parliament itself, she got so angry with him, Lady Astor. Incidentally, I've met her granddaughter, Lady Astor, who's a lovely woman. But Nancy Astor said to Rhodes in anger, "Sir, if I was your wife, I'd put poison in your tea." And he replied, "Well, madam, if I was your husband, I would drink it." That was Lady Astor, but Rhodes, of course, was sometime before Churchill, although their careers overlapped in a sense, because Churchill was there as a newspaper correspondent during the Second Anglo-Boer War, which Rhodes basically triggered by supporting the Jameson raid a couple of years earlier. It set the tone, but it did give the Boers under Kruger time to arm themselves, because they knew it was coming. And there was other fellows, Lionel Curtis, Reginald Brett, buoyed by the funding of the likes of Alfred Beit, Abe Bailey, Rhodes himself, and they formed the core and did much of the plotting and planning of the setting up this new world order, with the British Empire and later the Commonwealth on top. And at times, the conspiracies involved, like what I mentioned about Princess Radziwill, the Polish princess, who it turns out may well have been a spy for Rothschild. And that's why she was told to stick close to Rhodes to keep an eye on their investment. But the plots and the counterplots make one's head spin. But the luminaries, already by then called the Illuminati, were men and women undoubtedly of the highest intelligence and ability, who seamlessly stitched together a worldwide network of powerful and influential people to carry forward their all-encompassing vision, which was to basically control the world and to prevent more wars and to spread English as the language of the world, which they succeeded in doing, of course. Now, many conspiracy theorists would consider any kind of secret society body or Illuminati to be malevolent and manipulative. But many members of Rhodes's cabal were in fact were in fact immoral by the standards of the age, as mentioned or alluded to, but others were positively benign in their intentions to promote the interests of, firstly, an English-speaking worldwide hegemony, and secondly, become so powerful as to prevent any future wars. And from these beginnings, helped along by luminaries such as Jan Smuts, General Jan Smuts, which perhaps he may well be a subject of discussion in one of your future programs, being a very great personality in South African and world history, ended up as an allied field marshal, etc., but he was originally a Boer general. From that emerged the League of Nations, which Jan Smuts had a lot to do with, and various institutes of international affairs, and then by extension to America, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and the United Nations itself. So the germ, the core, the seed, may well have been sown by Rhodes for all of these organizations, and many of which people don't necessarily smile upon these days, but they are there. Wow. And the society, as mentioned, was very active. It's Rhodes' secret society into the build-up to the infamous Jameson raid to topple Kruger, the lead-up to both Anglo-Boer wars, both world wars, and in the latter, in their two conflicts, in their capacity as a shadow cabinet and their control of major newspapers and thus public opinion. But in those instances, First and Second World War, apparently largely as peacemakers and appeasers, or as the allegedly bellicose Churchill called them, he didn't like the fact that they were meddling behind the scenes, and he regarded them as defeatists. So there may be some truth to what some historians, revisionists, are saying, that Churchill very much wanted the war, and there were many British who didn't, and that Hitler himself, many will argue, never had any intention of crossing swords with Britain, a country he greatly admired. All that is for another discussion, but of course today the Rhodes Scholarships at university, at Oxford, and of course we have a university in South Africa called Rhodes University, a very prestigious one in Grahamstown, named after Rhodes. Everywhere you look in South Africa, there's buildings, there's roads, orchards and vineyards, and you name it, public buildings all over the place. And of course Rhodesia itself was established largely through his Rhodes charter company. And that all went wrong, though, but it built up into a very successful country. In fact, just the other day I was reading a book published in the late 1940s, just after the Second World War, as a guide to Rhodesia. It was a book they gave out on the Union Castle ocean liners, which were bringing people from Europe to come and settle there. It was basically an information guide, but a very comprehensive one, and it gave all the figures. It seemed that in 1948 in Rhodesia, and it seems very early days, that's just 50 years after the country was established, the mines were absolutely prospering, booming. The farms were flourishing. The capital city, Salisbury, was later changed to Harare, but Salisbury had every department store you could possibly imagine, every service you could possibly imagine. They had airline services, they had train services. This was a booming model country, Rhodesia. And it's so sad to look at it today, only 35 years after so-called independence. It's a ruin, an absolute ruin, and the economy is in tatters. The currency became the laughing stock of the world, and they were printing notes of trillions, of literally trillions of Zimbabwe dollars, etc. So unfortunately, a magnificent and booming country was absolutely ruined in the name of Africanization or independence, whatever you want to call it. But it was ruined. There's no question about it. So unfortunately, Rhodes' legacy there has essentially collapsed. And not only is he one of the few men in the world who had a country named after him, at least for close on a century, but he's strangely enough got a dog named after him, which the Americans, I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with, a Rhodesian Ridgeback.
Yes.
Which is a fine dog, a fine breed, and they were known as lion dogs. And I'm sure any owner of a Ridgeback will know the history of them. But essentially, they were brave dogs and very athletic, very brave and protective, and they were used to hunt down problem lions. A pack of them were brave enough to take on or corner or bay a lion. The ridge on their back is quite distinctive, of course, and that comes from the original, what they call the Africanus, which is the original African indigenous dog from probably West Africa. There's even the depictions of them in the tombs of the Egyptians with the pointed ears. The Rhodesian Ridgeback, of course, has the floppy ears, but they've been crossbred with Mastiff types to get increase in size. But that ridge is from the original Africanus, the Canis africanus, the African indigenous dog or semi-indigenous, and they tended to be resistant to tick-borne diseases, etc. And you still see them in fair numbers around South Africa today. They're still pretty popular, and I know they're very popular in the United States. Very good family dogs, very good guard dogs. And, of course, indirectly named after Rhodes because they were named after Rhodesia, which was named after him. So his legacy is far and wide. And it is, as we were saying earlier, a great shame that today you only hear bad things about him. He was a man of vision, a man of great energy, a man of determination, a man of very powerful personality, and he did more, some could argue, not only to build South Africa, but also to destroy it in a way, because the Second Anglo-Boer War was a devastating war, and he was, to a large extent, one of the triggers. So a lot of animosity could be held against him for that. But the Afrikaner Boer, as I mentioned, they tend to be more magnanimous than most people would expect, and they realized that he was doing what he thought was right, and he was doing what he thought was right for Britain. So they're magnanimous enough to accept that this man was a great man. He was their enemy at some stage, but he did a lot of good, and he also left us virtually his entire massive wealth and his huge legacy in real estate and funds, and we have to thank him for that at least. So he's definitely one of the great characters of South African history, and I think it's a shame that his memory is being besmirched now. He's not around to defend himself. I am personally not a fan of Cecil Rhodes. I'm an enthusiastic historian. That's the extent of my admiration for him. But I cannot ignore his greatness, whether one liked him or not. He was a great man, and certainly in a South African and world context, not just a local, upstart. He was depicted in cartoons as standing with 1 foot in Britain and 1 foot in South Africa as this colossus. And it's people, if they look carefully at that cartoon, it's quite a famous one, and one can Google it. If you just Google the Colossus of Rhodes, this cartoon normally pops up. And he's holding in his hands some wires, and it almost looks as though he's measuring from Cape to Cairo or from the UK to the Cape. He's in fact holding a telegraph wire. And he did achieve that. He managed to establish communications right across Africa. So you can in fact catch a train now. You might have to change railway gauges here and there as you go, but you can in fact catch a train from Cape to Cairo and on to London these days. So he was largely instrumental in that, and he has left behind bittersweet memories. As I say, he had no offspring, no progeny. He didn't seem, as we said, to have time for women, never married. His brother Frank, on the other hand, was a soldiering man and a very different type of character, and he was largely also involved in the Jameson raid as the military advisor. But everything went wrong, and not necessarily through his own fault. Jameson himself seemed to be a very confident person, and sometimes maybe overconfident. Strangely enough, a poem was written by Rudyard Kipling called "If," which is a very famous poem.
Very famous.
All about those. If you can keep your head while all about are losing theirs, etc., was written about Jameson, which will surprise many people because he's another one of those characters that people love to hate. He wasn't I don't think he was a very inspiring person, but he certainly had leadership qualities, and he was known as a very intelligent man, a very clever man, Jameson, and yet he was the one who completely hashed up this raid into the Transvaal. But Kipling wrote this poem, I think, in honor of him, to say that he basically gambled all on one throw of the dice, and he had the courage at least to do that. So another one of those characters, people love to hate, but certainly a very good friend of Rhodes, and definitely a prominent character in South African history as Rhodes was. But I think today,
to stop for an ad break there. If you would hold that thought, we'll
sure.
start again with the Jameson raid, but we're going to have to stop for an ad break. You're listening to Radio Free South Africa. This is your host, Karen Smith, And our guest tonight is Cuan Elgin, who wrote that magnificent book, Bulala, A True Story of South Africa, which I highly recommend you read if you want to understand anything about the South African situation. And we are talking about Cecil John Rhodes and his legacy in the southern half of Africa, because it doesn't apply only to South Africa. We were talking before the break about the Jameson raid. And what I found most interesting in researching Cecil John Rhodes was the fact that Mark Twain, everybody knows Mark Twain as an American author, he wrote about the Jameson raid because he was in the Transvaal shortly after that. So before we start bringing Cuan back in, I would like to read to you what Mark Twain said about the situation at that time. He said, "I have got at the truth of that puzzling South African situation, which is this. The capitalists and other chief men of Johannesburg were fretting under various political and financial burdens imposed by the state, the South African Republic, sometimes called the Transvaal, and desired to procure, by peaceful means, a modification of the laws. Mr. Cecil Rhodes set himself the task of warming the lawful and legitimate petitions and supplications of the eight Landers into seditious talk, and their frettings into threatenings. The final outcome to be revolt and armed rebellion. If he could bring about a bloody collision between those people and the Boer government, Great Britain would have to interfere. Her interference would be resisted by the Boers. She would chastise them and add the Transvaal to her South African possessions. It was not a foolish idea, but a rational and practical one." By the middle of December 1895, the explosion seemed imminent. Mr. Rhodes was helping to procure arms for Johannesburg. He was also arranging to have Jameson break over the border and come to Johannesburg with 600 mounted men at his back. Jameson, as per instructions from Rhodes perhaps, wanted a letter from the reformers requesting him to come to their aid. He got the letter, that famous one urging him to fly to the rescue of the women and children. He got it 2 months before he flew. From that time until the 29th of December, a good deal of the reformers' time was taken up with energetic efforts to keep Jameson from coming to their assistance. Jameson's invasion had been set up for the 26th. The reformers were not ready. The town was not united. Some wanted a fight, some wanted peace, some wanted a new government, some wanted the existing one reformed. Apparently very few wanted the revolution to take place in the interest and under the ultimate shelter of the imperial flag. Yet a report began to spread that Mr. Rhodes's embarrassing assistance had for its end this latter object. Jameson endured postponement 3 days, then resolved to wait no longer. Without any orders, excepting Mr. Rhodes's significant silence, he cut the telegraph wires on the 29th and made his plunge that night to go to the rescue of the women and children by urgent request of a letter, now 9 days old, as per date, a couple of months old, in fact. Jameson would have to ride 150 miles. He knew that there were suspicions abroad in the Transvaal concerning him, but he expected to get through to Johannesburg before they should become general and obstructive. But a telegraph wire had been overlooked and not cut. It spread the news of his invasion far and wide, and a few hours after his start, the Boer farmers were riding hard from every direction to intercept him. As soon as it was known in Johannesburg that he was on his way to rescue the women and children, the grateful people put the women and children in a train and rushed them for Australia. In fact, the approach of Johannesburg's saviour created panic and consternation there, and a multitude of males of peaceable disposition swept to the trains like a sandstorm. The early ones fared best. They secured seats by sitting in them. 8 hours before the first train was timed to leave, Mr. Rhodes lost no time. He cabled the renowned Johannesburg letter of invitation to the London press, the grey-headed piece of ancient history that ever went over a cable. The new poet laureate lost no time. He came out with a rousing poem lauding Jameson's prompt and splendid heroism in flying to the rescue of the women and children. For the poet could not know that he did not fly until 2 months after the invitation. He was deceived by the false date of the letter, which was December 20th. Jameson was intercepted by the Boers on New Year's Day, and on the next day he surrendered. He had carried his copy of the letter along, and if his instructions required him, in case of emergency, to see to it that it fell into the hands of the Boers, he loyally carried them out. But there's a very funny part in this as well. When Jameson raises the white flag on 1st of January 1986, it is the 5th consecutive time that British forces surrender to Boer commandos. This attracts Twain's attention and leads him to comment, "There is a story, which may or may not be true, about an ignorant Boer farmer there who thought that this white flag was the national flag of England. He had been at Bronkhorstspruit and Lang's Neck, and Ingogo and Amajuba, and supposed that the English did not run up their flag excepting at the end of a fight." So that was very funny, that this so-called ignorant Boer thought that the white flag was the flag of the British, because at 5 fights that he had been in with them, they raised the white flag. So for the American listeners, Mark Twain was there, and he wrote about it. And the poem that Cuan was talking about earlier, "To Be a Man, My Son," was written at that time about that raid, and yet it was written under false understandings, as Mark Twain sees it anyway. I don't know the truth or untruth of that. But he understood that these men, Jameson, were flying to the aid of the British, of the women and children. Meanwhile, he'd had the letter for a whole month and had been stalling under Rhodes's instructions, as I understand it. What do you think about that, Cuan?
Indeed. Dr. Jim, as Jameson was known, definitely hatched the plot along with Rhodes, with the complicity of landlords, as I mentioned, these wealthy financiers and gold mine owners, landlords Lionel Phillips, Abe Bailey, and Cecil Rhodes' soldiering brother, who we mentioned earlier, Francis William Rhodes, and allegedly with the new British colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, who was unlovingly nicknamed Pushful Joe. And as you rightly say, the scheme was to invade the Transvaal goldfields from Bechuanaland, which is now Botswana, where Jameson was the colonial administrator, with a column of 500 well-armed men who would be supported by an uprising of so-called disaffected Uitlanders, these outlanders or foreigners who'd been secretly armed and worked into a frenzy of anti-Boer, of hatred against the Boers through propaganda, led by a so-called reform committee. But as you say, nothing for the raiders went as planned, and the anticipated general uprising did not materialize, mainly due to apathy. And I've got some lovely quotes here why they were apathetic. I'll give them to you. But in the vain hope of precipitating the rebellion, Jameson's column, as you mentioned, attacked anyway, invaded anyway in the last days of 1895. And then his men incompetently cut the wrong telegraph wire, as you did allude to that, to Pretoria, where Paul Kruger, the president of the Boers, continued to receive regular updates on Jameson's progress, courtesy of Dr. Jim's own telegrams to the 800 plotters. So they were aware of it all the time. And as you rightly say, the column was soon surrounded by Boer commandos forced to surrender near Krugersdorp, ironically, and the rest of the plotters arrested on January the 2nd, 1896. In the resulting furore, now I'm quoting quite extensively from my book Bulala, in the resulting furore, Joseph Chamberlain protested that he knew nothing about the abortive raid, and the blame fell squarely on Rhodes, who was forced to resign as governor of the Cape. And incidentally, he became a parliamentarian, Rhodes, at the age of 29, quite unusual.
Wow.
So he was a seasoned politician by the time this happened, although still a young man. The Boers, of course, were outraged at the attempted coup, and Kruger, the president, was remarkably magnanimous. Initially, they were found guilty and sentenced to death, and he showed great magnanimity and statesmanship by dispatching Jameson and the 5 officers who led the raid to Britain for trial, saying, they were British subjects and they had invaded his country, and he wanted Britain now to do something about it. So he actually commuted the death sentences and imposed stiff fines, and then send them off to Britain for trial. And so despite the rugged nature of the Boers, they were generally considered courteous gentlemen, even in war, often to their own disadvantage, for they were seldom given the same gentlemanly treatment by a nation, Britain, that had long prided itself on being the epitome of refinement and chivalry. And amazingly, the British Crown later responded by knighting a number of the plotters for their, quote, exemplary services to the realm. So the British Crown approved of this attempted raid. They would have approved much more if it had succeeded, although they had to pretend that they were shocked by it all and knew nothing about it. But it raised the heat. The animosity between the Afrikaner Boers and the Boer republics now felt towards Britain was palpable, and the heat was raised even further by a telegram, a rather tactless one, from Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who, of course, was related to Queen Victoria quite closely. He sent a telegram to President Kruger congratulating him on foiling the attempted coup, and it read, and it's quite short, so I'll just read it. It said, this is Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, writing to President Kruger, I express to you my sincere congratulations that without appealing for the help of friendly powers, so he was saying they tacitly supported the Boers, you and your people have succeeded in repelling with your own forces the armed bands which had broken into your country, and in maintaining the independence of your country against foreign aggression. So he was letting it be known they knew that Britain was behind this. It wasn't just a banditry thing. It was a foreign forces and foreign aggression and so on. And the dispatch, it seems, it was rather like rubbing salt in an open sore and further insulting already wounded British pride. And the previous tentative, uneasy public opinion held by Englishmen in both Britain and South Africa concerning the connivings of their newly elected Conservative government suddenly changed to wholesale support for Jameson and Chamberlain. And the mutual hostility between Boer and Englishmen mounted even further. And once again, they would end up facing each other over the barrel of a gun. But this time it wouldn't be minor battles like the First Anglo-Boer War. This would become a full-scale war. And Chamberlain, while protesting at home that the war in South Africa would be long and costly, redoubled his own political pressure on President Kruger. And Pushful Joe, as they called him, apparently secretly wanted war, but professed outwardly that he would prefer federation. So they were wanting a federation of Southern Africa. So he therefore skillfully manipulated events and perceptions to try and make Kruger look like the aggressor and to give the false appearance that war was forced on the British. His masterstroke was appointing Sir Alfred Milner as High Commissioner. He was a brilliant administrator with an abiding hatred for the Boers, and less masterful, however, was his, Joe Chamberlain's appointment of General Sir Redvers Buller as the new Commander-in-Chief of British forces in South Africa. So the path to war with Britain was now being covertly paved by Lord Milner, and the wily old Boer Republic President Kruger. He'd been alerted to the Transvaal's military vulnerability by the Jameson raid. He set about arming his young republic, and they bought many thousands of excellent German Mausers, some French state-of-the-art long tom, as they were known, artillery pieces, and some German artillery pieces, etc. And eventually had a fair old army waiting for the British to launch their war against them, which they eventually, of course, did. And the pretext for war, the raison d'être that the British had, was they kept trying to force this issue about giving the votes to the foreigners and so on. And by then, the foreign prospectors on the goldfields outnumbered the Boers in their own country, and Kruger knew that these people had no real want of the vote, and this was being used as a pretext by Britain. And in fact, I can quote here from Bulala, my book, a very telling piece, which was written by a British MP, Michael Davitt, And he, in fact, he resigned from the British Parliament in protest against Britain's actions leading up to the Second Anglo-Boer War, which he witnessed firsthand. And he wrote in his book, the book's called The Boer Fight for Freedom, Michael Davitt. And if I can quote what he says there, he says, its objects, that's Britain's objects, were obvious to the Transvaal government and to all who followed with any attention the so-called movement for the redress of the intolerable grievances of what he calls the German Jews and their cosmopolitan adventurers. He was talking about the bankers, which was carried on by the paid agents of Mrs. Rhodes, Byte, Eichstein and Company in Johannesburg. He goes on to say, one comment upon the so-called grievances thus manufactured by a subsidized press is the honest and manly view of an upright British soldier who'd been conversant with the whole situation in Johannesburg. And this will be enough to lay bare the hollow mockery and the mercenary and mendacious character of the movement upon the existence of which Mr. Chamberlain and Sir Alfred Milner grounded their pretext for a policy of war. And he quotes Captain March Phillips, who was a British soldier. So this is interesting, coming from a British soldier, who his assessment of why the war was launched. And in Captain March Phillips' book, which is called With Remington, there was a mounted cavalry called, or mounted infantry, in fact, sort of cavalry. His book is called With Remington. They were called the Remington Scouts. Anyway, he goes on to say that he was writing now both as an Uitlander, a foreigner himself, and an English officer who fought in the war. He says, quote, as for the Uitlanders, the foreigners, and their grievances, I would not ride a yard or fire a shot to right all the grievances that were ever invented. The mass of Uitlanders, that is, the miners and the working men on the Rand, the Witwatersrand, with the goldfields, had no grievances. I know what I am talking about, for I have lived and worked amongst them. I have seen English newspapers pass from one to the other, and roars of laughter roused by the Times telegrams about these precious grievances. We used to have to read the London papers to find out what our grievances were. In other words, they were invented, and very frequently they would be due to causes of which we had never even heard. I never met one miner or working man who would have walked a mile to pick up the vote off the road, and I have known and talked with scores and hundreds. And no man who knows the Witwatersrand, the goldfields, will deny the truth of what I'm telling you. No, he says, the Uitlanders the world had heard of were not these, but the stock exchange operators, manipulators of the money markets, company floaters, and gamblers, a large percentage of them, he says, Jews. They voiced Johannesburg ahead, they had the press in their hands, they worked the wires and controlled and arranged what sort of information would reach England. As for the grievances, they were a most useful invention and had a hand in the making of many fortunes. It was by these that a feeling of insecurity was introduced into the market, which would otherwise have remained always steady. It was by these that the necessary and periodic slump was brought about. When the proper time came, grievances such as would arrest England's attention and catch the ear of the people were deliberately invented. And those are from page 41 and 42 of David's book. Incidentally, I did a bit of research on Rhodes' background and Milner as regard Rothschild. It seems very clear that Milner and Rhodes were also Rothschild agents. Rhodes obtained, as I alluded to earlier in our chat, Rhodes obtained £1 million loan, which would today be at least £20 million, which in dollar terms I think would be about $35 million, a huge amount of money in those days, from Rothschilds of London in 1887. This is early days. This is only 10 years after the diamond fields kicked off. He managed to arrange a loan, and with that loan, Rhodes acquired the claims of Compagnie Française de Mines de Diamants du Cap, which is the French company of the Cape Diamond Mines next to Kimberley Central. De Beers Consolidated Mines was founded in 1888, merging with the controlling shares of the nearby mines in Kimberley Central, Toistbun and Bultfontein, and then by then controlled 90% of the world's diamonds, and to this day. Ernest Oppenheimer arrived in South Africa in 1902, the year Rhodes died. So it is almost as though he stepped in where when Rhodes died.
Yeah.
As an agent, he came, Ernest Oppenheimer, as an agent for diamond brokers A. Duckelsbühler and Co., German. However, Oppenheimer then founded his own Anglo-American Corporation of South Africa, which we've alluded to, in 1917, which is closely associated with De Beers. And the two companies, since 1929, have almost always shared the same chairman. Initially, the primary goal of Anglo-American was to mine gold in the Witwatersrand. However, in 1919, 5 years after the South African Union Army invaded Southwest Africa to drive out their former allies, the Germans, Anglo-American began acquiring diamond interests, which had formerly belonged to the German Diamond Regie, or regiment, in what is now Namibia. And the next year, these diamonds interests were transferred to a specially formed corporation, Consolidated Diamond Mines of Southwest Africa, which is the very year that the League of Nations, which we alluded to earlier, as being having sprung from this secret society, New World Order, that was very much a part of Rhodes's vision, that was placed under South African administration. So these things lead one to another, and Rhodes was party, good or bad, to great world events in his quest for reuniting the Americas and the lost colonies, as he almost considered them, and Britain. And Anglo-American, in a sense, was a way to do it. Even the name tells you that. But by late 1899, with all the threats and the maneuvers, British troops maneuvering on the borders, but Kruger also was at fault here because he sent a very bluntly worded message to the British that they must remove their troops from the borders of the Boer republics or face war. So that's really what the British wanted to hear. They were delighted to receive his message, and by then the Boers were just as determined as the British to take the offensive. But they'd failed to learn a valuable lesson from their first war of independence, the first Anglo-Boer War 20 years earlier, that of not wasting valuable manpower and resources in besieging strategically unimportant, small and scattered British garrisons. Their mobility was their strength, but unfortunately only for 6 to 8 months did they really give the British a pounding, and then the weight of arms of the British, something like 500,000, 500,000 British troops were eventually employed to subjugate 50,000 Boer combatants. So there was no way they could win in the end. But what triggered the war eventually was the Boers themselves invading the Cape Colony and laying siege to Kimberley, the famous diamond fields, which should have been theirs in the first place, and they trapped Rhodes himself in the town. And so it was more of an ideological thing. They also trapped in the town of Mafeking, which was where the stores for the Jameson raid were kept. So they saw that almost as a poetic justice. They trapped in that town a very famous man. His name was Colonel Sir Robert Stevenson Smythe Baden-Powell. And of course, Colonel Baden-Powell, later Lord Baden-Powell, was the starter of the Boy Scouts. The worldwide Boy Scouts movement started in Mafeking. He used young boys as messengers, and they eventually formed themselves into kind of a military-style outfit, and which became the Boy Scouts. And they're worldwide now, of course. That started during the siege of Mafeking. Rhodes, by this stage, was, as I say, trapped in Kimberley, and he, being the powerful and influential and forceful character he was, he basically took over the defense of Kimberley, irritating very much the British garrison commander there. But he was a forceful person, and he still didn't believe that the Boers had any chance, and he was right eventually, of course, of resisting the might of Britain. So he knew it was a matter of time. And Kimberley itself was an important crossroads because the railway from the Cape ran up through Kimberley. And the British, the best way for them to move their troops up country, of course, was by train. So the Boers' stranglehold on Kimberley had to be relieved, and the siege of Kimberley, which basically immobilized a lot of Boer troops unnecessarily at that stage. The siege lasted 4 months and would bring out the best and the worst in Rhodes's character. And not being a man to sit around and bemoan his fate, he energetically set about organizing the defenses of the town. And he placed his workshops of the De Beers Company at the military's disposal, established soup kitchens for the inhabitants, and as I mentioned, generally irritated the garrison commander, who was Lieutenant Colonel Kerkovich. And Rhodes really got under his skin by issuing military orders, although he was a civilian.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and even liaising with the relieving force, which he was on its way, And if he ever felt that his autocracy was being resisted, he even threatened to hand the town over to the Boers. So he really made a nuisance of himself, but he really also, in a way, held things together. And when the defenders of Kimberley, the British, found that their own artillery was outranged by the Boers' long tom cannons, well, initially their German cannons, Krupps, Rhodes oversaw the construction in his company workshops from scratch of a better cannon with 28-pound shells. They made this thing from scratch, and they called it the Long Cecil. And the wife of the mayor of Kimberley had the privilege of pulling the lanyard to fire Long Cecil's first answering shot at the besieging Boers. But the Boers, realizing then the British had come up with a better cannon, which could reach their guns, sent for one of their Long Tom cannons, which was this famous cannon, still famous today, French cannon, Creusot. It had an unprecedented, very accurate range of over 7 miles or 10 plus kilometers. And ironically, one of the first shells fired by this newly deployed Long Tom crashed through the roof of the hotel and killed the engineer who'd built the British Long Cecil.
Oh,
Quite strange.
Wow.
But when the besieging Boers heard of this, they naturally assumed divine intervention on their behalf again, and who could disagree? Even the cynical Cecil Rhodes may have briefly mulled the thought over in his mind. So it went on. The Boer War dragged on on 3 years, and it devastated the country. The Boers were, as I say, initially giving the British Army a real hammering because they used their mobility, hit and run, commando type warfare against a very cumbersome army, the British Army, with very long drawn out logistics. And the British still were fighting in the Napoleonic style of advancing across open country in formation, marching into the teeth of the enemy, and suffering heavy losses. Eventually, of course, they caught on, and they started to bring in colonial troops from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, who were more used to sort of the bush style of warfare, fast mobile, mounted, hit and run. And then they started to make some gains. And slowly but surely, they also devastated the countryside. They established a policy of scorched earth where they would destroy the Boer farms because they knew that was where they were getting their food supplies. And to the extent of chopping down the orchards, poisoning the stumps, poisoning the wells, killing or confiscating the livestock, taking the women who were left there on those farms while the men were off on commando, taking the Boer women and children, and putting them into concentration camps. And it was a merciless guerrilla war of attrition. And the Boer women and children suffered terribly in these camps. The sanitation was poor, the food was poor, the medical supplies were virtually non-existent, and they died in their droves. And in fact, they say about 2/3 of the Boer children died in these camps, 2/3. And something like 27,000, others say it was over 30,000 Boer civilians died miserable deaths in these camps. So it was a terrible war, and it eventually came to a point where the Boer commanders were in the field starving. Their supply lines had been cut off, their farms had been destroyed, and Kruger was now under threat of capture himself because the British Army had now advanced through. They'd lifted the sieges on Kimberley and Mafeking and Ladysmith, and they took Bloemfontein, which was the capital of the Orange Free State, the Southern Boer Republic, and they were now marching on Pretoria. And strangely, when the Union of South Africa happened 10 years after this war ended, both English-speaking and Afrikaans-speaking Boer recruits would march to this marching song that the British used, which was called Marching to Pretoria. It became a marching song. But either way, Kruger was now under threat of being captured himself and humiliated by the British. He fled Pretoria by train to avoid capture, and eventually made his way to what was then called Lorenzo Marques, which was a Portuguese controlled port in what was Mozambique. It's still Mozambique today, although the port is now called Maputo. And the Dutch Queen sent out a warship to collect him and take him to Europe. And there's much rumoring to this day, and the legend of the Kruger Millions, as it's known, where it's said that Kruger took huge amounts of gold in chests on this train with him when he fled to fund what they thought would be a drawn-out guerrilla war. which he would direct from Europe and use the money, the gold, the Kruger millions, so-called, to fund this drawn-out war. And yet this gold has never been found to this day. And many people have spent their entire lives searching for the Kruger millions. It was rumored that it was hidden in caves on the way along to Mozambique. Others say Kruger took it on board with him and it's in a Swiss bank, and all these rumors. But to this day, this gold's never been recovered. But strangely enough, a Boer seer, a prophet, a chap called Sina van Rensburg, Sina merely means seer, Janse van Rensburg, he prophesied many things, and virtually all of which have already come about. And he was so accurate in his predictions. He would tell the Boers they can sleep tonight. They don't have to put out sentries. The British are not coming. And sure as nuts, that's exactly what happened. They'd sleep peacefully and the British wouldn't come. Or he would say, we have to move, the British are coming. And once again, he was right. And he was right on so many things. He predicted the outcome of battles. He predicted that one of the Boer generals, a very popular one called General de la Rey, would capture a British general in a particular battle, and he did. He captured Lord Methuen. So he was very much revered by his own people, and his prophecies were considered pretty accurate. And he actually prophesied that this gold, which has been missing since the Anglo-Boer War, these so-called Kruger millions, would be used to fund a third freedom war, which of course hasn't come about as we speak, to create a new Boer republic, free of the shackles of what was Britain then, but now it would be, of course, a black government. We have the ANC in power, we have for 22 years, and he prophesied that this gold would reappear at the time it's most needed to fund a third freedom war. So all very interesting. But many books have been written about the fabled legendary Kruger millions, the Kruger gold. But sadly, Kruger was a broken man by then. He was a very old man, and he arrived in Europe. He was eventually taken through. He did, in fact, go to Switzerland, and in fact, he died just shortly afterwards. A broken man. He never got back to his country to see it again, and the war dragged on, and eventually the British had just devastated the countryside. They devastated the Boer republics. They had created a genocide, essentially, on the Boer people. It was almost like a Roman invasion in a sense that they deported the captives. The British took the Boers who had been captured, the commandos, and they shipped them to the furthest lands all over the world, parts of their colonies, into prison camps. So they shipped thousands, tens of thousands of these Boer combatants who'd either surrendered or been captured to places like Ceylon, these days Sri Lanka, and India, and Burma, and Bahamas, strangely, prison camps there. St. Helena Island, which is out in the middle of the Atlantic. It's the same island that Napoleon was exiled to after he lost his support in Europe and lost the wars there. St. Helena, the big camps, prison camps, were established in these far-flung colonies and islands to harbour the captured Boers. So they deported these men, and it took a couple of years for them all to eventually be released and come back after the wars had ended. So it was almost a genocide, you could say. And it set the course for the next 100 years. This country still suffers the effects of that war, in the same way that the North and the South in the United States, to many, the wounds are still raw in many ways of what was done. But eventually, we as a people, the South Africans, we've put our differences aside, and the English-speaking South Africans and the Afrikaans-speaking South Africans, Afrikaners or Boers, as they choose to call themselves, some of them, we are one people now. We are white Africans, and we've put our differences aside, and it was a century or more ago, so we cannot keep fighting the Anglo-Boer War in our heads. But it did devastate the country. But eventually, the British and Rhodes' dream of a united South Africa came about. As a result of this war, Rhodes had died by then. He died just short of age 50 in Cape Town. His ill health eventually caught up with him, and his dying words apparently was so much to do, so little done. And I think it epitomizes the spirit of the man. He was a goer. He was a dynamic person. He worked hard. He had a great vision. He used his money. He never had that much interest in money. Quite ironically, he said it more than once. It's not the money; it's what it enables me to do. It gave him the power to do what he wanted to do, and it gave him the power to carry out his vision, which was a united South Africa, first of all, a united Southern Africa, Rhodesia being part of it, but Bechuanaland, now called Botswana, was a British protectorate. Really more than for any other reason than to keep the Boers from perhaps expanding north. That all became Southern Africa, and it was ruled by the British for quite a long time. So his vision did come about, but that's all pretty much fallen apart, as some might say, politically, that Britain doesn't rule or control South Africa or Southern Africa anymore. But they do, in many ways, control a lot of the wealth, a lot of the mining, through the banking system and through the ownership of the mines, etc. So they still do exert a great control. Although I think a lot of the assets, certainly financial assets, have been taken offshore now because of the political situation here, where we get political upstarts who want to nationalise mines and nationalise banks and so on. So a lot of the wealth has been taken offshore, and yet the fingers are still in the pie. We are very much controlled by multinationals, and the current government, as I say, a lot of them play along with it because they get preferential shares, directorships, etc. on these mining house boards. They end up owning some of the mines. Unfortunately, they lack the vision, most of them. They lack the long-term vision. And we've had many cases of these connected people or connected to the current government, the ANC, who've been given essentially mines, prosperous mines, on a plate to keep them in the fold. They don't even bother to carry on mining. They cut down all the headgear and all the metal and sell it off as scrap. And thousands of miners are out of a job, and the mine falls apart and then starts being looted by essentially amateur miners, and chaotic. Very, very lacking in vision, no long-term plan. So Rhodes' vision in many ways has crumbled, but yet it still remains in many ways too. As I mentioned, his real estate, vast holdings are now given to the people of South Africa by Rhodes. They were bequeathed to the people of South Africa. He bequeathed his huge monetary fortune to the people of South Africa for good works, for scholarships, etc., as in the Rhodes Scholarship. So we can thank him for that at least. But he was very instrumental in the Jameson raid earlier, which led to the Anglo-Boer War eventually. So although his vision was to unite South Africa, a lot of it went wrong, and it ended up in a devastating war. But ultimately, South Africa was united in 1910. The Union of South Africa was formed, where the two Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, as they were known, were amalgamated with Natal, which was a British colony or administered by the Crown, and the Cape Colony, which is a huge area, which was a colony as such, a British colony, and it became the Union of South Africa, 4 provinces, 4 very big provinces. But the new government, the ANC, which eventually took over in 1994, has divided the country up again into 9 provinces, and it's really all it's done is create such huge administration and jobs for pals that it hasn't worked particularly well. And of the 9 provinces, only 1 is controlled by anybody other than the ANC, and that's the Western Cape, which is only a portion of the original Cape province, but it's the best part, and it's well run generally by the only viable so far opposition in the country, and the ANC are desperate to take the Cape. So that if they do that, I think that would be pretty much the end of Rhodes' vision in terms of a South Africa run by English people, English-speaking people, with Britain as the mother country, etc. That's all pretty much long gone. So we left with a lot of good. We've left with some bad. But Rhodes can certainly claim, I think, more than anybody else in South African history, to have built the country into an industrial and mining giant. We're the only one really in Africa that became a first world country for the period when it was between the Anglo-Boer War and the Union of South Africa and the ANC taken over in 1994. So almost a century. We were very much a first world country. We were Western allies. We fought on the side of the Western allies in the First World War, in the Korean War, and in the Second World War, fought on the side of the Western allies. But that's all been forgotten, it seems. And now we are ruled by essentially a communistic type government, or there's certainly a big communist influence in the inner circle in the cabinet. So it's very much a changed country. But for that century, the 20th century, South Africa became very much the powerhouse of Africa, and the combined GDP, the gross domestic product of South Africa, was greater than the whole of the rest of Africa put together. But unfortunately, just in the last few years, we've slipped down the rungs a bit, and we're now only the second biggest economy in Africa, in Nigeria. One wonders at it, but it has overtaken South Africa, apparently, in the economy, and we unfortunately seem to be slipping down the rung. We're no longer a first world country. A lot of our infrastructure is still in good nick because it was so well established initially, so we can be proud of that. And we have amongst the best, believe it or not, and ironically, banking systems in the world. And it's highly regarded. We had amongst the best educational facilities in the world, including University of Cape Town and Rhodes University. The University of Cape Town established on Rhodes's land. And Rhodes, of course, Rhodes University itself, named after him, and very much part of it. So we have many universities, and they were considered amongst the best in the world. Unfortunately, once again, we're slipping down the rungs. Our education system is not as highly regarded as it was. So we've gone backwards in many ways from what we were. And at the moment, unfortunately, there's a lot of schools being burnt down for the strangest reasons. Protests, something like 20 schools in the last few weeks, burnt to the ground. Various protests about things got nothing to do with schools. Housing protests, lack of housing protests, lack of this, lack of that, give, burn down schools as protests. And the strange thing is that in the 1976 Soweto riots, which became world famous or infamous, the slogan of the rioting students was liberation before education, while they were burning down their schools. Yeah. And at the time, the ANC, which is now in power, said that they would make this country ungovernable. Well, schools are still being burnt down 22 years after the ANC took over. So one has to be careful what one wishes for. And I'm sure, as the saying goes, Rhodes would turn in his grave if he knew that at this day, at this time, people are wanting to pull down his statues, which weren't necessarily put up to admire him. They were put up to commemorate him, like most statues were and are. And that a student on a Rhodes Scholarship has got the gall to be leading the campaign to have his statues pulled down. I think he would turn in his grave on the Matopos Hills in Rhodesia, dear old Cecil. But as I say, I personally, as a historian, am not a great admirer of the man necessarily, but certainly of what he achieved. One has to give him that. He achieved an incredible amount, and he left a huge legacy to the people of South Africa. I don't see many other people in the world who've done that, so one has to give him that. He was a great man, and not just in the South African context, but in the world context. And I think he deserves to be treated more gently by history. Certainly, at the time, he was in his own life. He was greatly revered, greatly respected, greatly admired, and the reasons for his imperialism were, on the surface, honourable. He believed at the time Britain was the greatest power in the world. He correctly recognized that, and he saw them as a great force for good. And let's face it, colonialism has its detractors, and it had a downside, but it established the infrastructure and the administrations and the educational systems and the medical health systems, etc., of virtually all the colonies, many of which were in Africa, and those haven't been maintained to a large extent. They're crumbling. Yet that was the good side of colonialism. And they say, there's an old saying, the only thing worse than not being the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. So if nobody invests in your country, it remains a third world country. So and you have a choice at the end of the day whether you want to work for these people or not. So one has to be pragmatic and see that the colonialists did a lot of good in amongst the bad. And I mentioned on one of our previous interviews, I had the opportunity to address a gathering in the parliamentary buildings a couple of years ago. And it was one of the gatherings of sort of minority groups who feel they've been sidelined by the current regime, who their concerns aren't being addressed, and they feel they've been kind of forgotten by history. And they got together, including a delegation of Afrikaner Boers, and some small African tribes who were promised their own land by the Queen, Victoria, and they didn't get it because Britain reneged on its promises, perfidious Albion and all that. And they got together to show solidarity. And I listened with great interest to one of the smaller ethnic groups, which are the Khoi, who were actually the only original inhabitants of South Africa, not the black tribes. They moved down as the whites were moving up from the Cape, so they have no greater claim to this country than the so-called white tribe. But either way, the Khoi, the Aboriginals, who are not sub-Saharan Negroes, they're a totally distinct ethnic group. They were, one of their representatives was carrying on about the legacy of colonialism, in a negative way, legacy of colonialism and the legacy of imperialism and this and that. I listened with interest, and then when I got my chance to speak, I said, I hear what you say, and it's very interesting, and from your perspective, I can quite understand what you're saying. But let's get real. If it wasn't for the legacy of colonialism, we wouldn't be sitting in this magnificent building on these comfortable leather seats and having this seminar. We'd be sitting on boulders on the side of a hill, because that's all there was here. There was nothing. The Boers, who were the offshoot of the Cape Dutch, and then the British, and as much as we might criticise the British role in South Africa in terms of the Anglo-Boer War, etc., they built the country into an industrial giant and a mining giant. It was very much the British, so we have to give them at least that accolade. So between them, these two antagonists, these two white races, as they referred to them in those days, the British considered themselves a race, and they saw the Boers as another race, a European race as such, as they called it then. So these two white races, or white South African groupings, between them built this country. And for this young student who's at Rhodes, who's on the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, to say that this was all built on the sweat of his forefathers, it's absolute nonsense. In fact, the country was built in spite of them. And yes, labour was needed, but I look at Australia. They didn't use the Aborigines, as such as they called them, to build Australia. They built it themselves with their hands, and we were no different. Black labour was used, but it was voluntary black labour. We've never slavery was abolished in South Africa 30 years before it was abolished, more than 30 years before it was abolished in the United States. The impression that the country was built by black people under the whip is absolute rubbish. It's a political ploy, and it sort of justifies, if you can use that word, it's the wrong word, the claim today that all the land belongs to the black folk, and it's not true. And anybody who studied their history, including this young student, should know that. And this is where historians come in, is that we present the evidence from many, many sources, and it's documented. It was documented at the time. Many more sources have become available since then. We can prove chapter and verse who built the country, how they built the country, with what resources they built the country, who had the title deeds, who arrived first, who arrived last. That can all be proven. So this political rhetoric about the whites don't belong here, and we've been here 360 years. And Rhodes, in his very short life, contributed hugely to the physical development of the country and the political development in good and bad ways. But certainly he's a towering character, and he puts everyone else in his shadow, really. I do notice, ironically, that the Rhodes scholarship is now administered by the Mandela Rhodes Foundation.
Yes,
Now,
yes.
yes, so it's kind of been hijacked, for political expediency, but it was Rhodes's legacy, and it still is. And I think, we need to recognize that, and the realities of history, rhetoric and Marxist rewriting of history, they can do their worst. But while there are historians around who have the facts at their fingertips, I think we just have to keep refuting all these ridiculous statements of theirs. And it's been an absolute pleasure to take part in your show, where we bring to light in the last program Jan Smuts, Jan van Riebeck, hopefully soon Jan Smuts,
Yes,
and people like Cecil Rhodes, the towering characters, not political loudmouths. These were real men who really did things and really built things, and that you can see it on the ground to this day. The castle that the Dutch built 350 years ago is still there. The beautiful gardens and the magnificent public buildings that Cecil Rhodes commissioned had built are still there. These are brick and mortar, indisputable evidence of what these great men did. All these political upstarts who've had a lot to say and blown a lot of hot air around the place have built nothing. They've built nothing. Yet the publicity they've been given, and they've been built up into these little demigods, history will record that they actually built nothing. So at the end of the day, good men and bad, they'll be remembered by what they built, what they created, and what enduring, not passing political expediency. And I think Rhodes can rightfully be his memory be held up as one of the men, if not the greatest South African in terms of building the country. Cecil John Rhodes, quite a man.
Cuan, thank you very, very much. We're coming up to the end of the show, but I would really like to thank you, because most people don't understand how much work goes into a show of this kind. You have done unbelievable amounts of research in order to speak so confidently about this man. And love him or hate him, he did a tremendous amount of enduring good for Southern Africa. I'm hoping that people will please pay attention, because we do our homework. We really try to present the facts, whether not to make them fit in with our narrative, just to present the facts, so that you can get a picture of how South Africa was formed and how it came to be what it is today. And also you need to keep an eye on history, because if you don't, you may be forced to repeat it. And that is my biggest worry for the rest of the world today, that they have not kept an eye on what is going on in South Africa, and they are now facing what we have already lived through. Thank you very much, Cuan. We hope to speak again soon and to bring you our next historical figure of South Africa. Thank you for listening, and good night.